that's quite the introduction. I don't know if I have enough wisdom for that.
I know you do.
Thank you everybody for having me today. You are amazingly awake for 3:30 in the afternoon on a day like today. So it must have been a lot of really good speakers. I hope I live up to everybody else's, all the speeches that have been going so far. So as she mentioned, I'm Director of Fiscal Policy Research for Moody's Analytics. This is the part of the speech where I have to give a disclaimer to make sure that the lawyers aren't listening in to me and to make sure that I don't get in a lot of trouble. So I work for Moody's Analytics, which is a totally separate company from Moody's Investor Service. Okay, so Moody's Investor Service is the ratings agency. Moody's Analytics, we do economic consulting, we do data analytics. Think of it like the dark side and the light side of the force. They're the dark side, we're the light side. We're here to help. We're not here to get you in trouble or stand. So please don't let anything that I say today be misconstrued as having any bearing whatsoever on past, current, or future ratings actions. That sounds like it was written by a lawyer because it was. It keeps me out of trouble. Okay? So what did I come here to talk to you about? I came to talk to you about the economy. Since you haven't spent enough time today talking about the economy, they thought maybe we should have an economist end the day just to thoroughly make sure you're bummed out before you go home and get in the traffic and get in a really good mood on your way home today. When I talk about economics these days, the number one question that I'm being asked is when is the next recession? How many economists are in the room? Quite a few. When was the last time you heard the word when is the next, or the question, when is the next recession? 10 minutes ago. Like 10 minutes ago, right? It's constant. So I'm going to make you all feel really good about the economics profession. Because we don't really know. I might be the only economist that ever tells you that. But don't tell them I told you, because I'll get in trouble. They'll take away my membership card. But we don't really know. Whenever I'm asked about the next recession, it always reminds me of a story that I heard once about J.P. Morgan. I mean J.P. Morgan, the person, not J.P. Morgan, the company. Right? Everybody familiar with J.P. Morgan? Okay, so the several people that would, no, I have no idea who that is. Is that a real person? I thought it was just a bank. J.P. Morgan is probably the most influential banker in the history of the United States. Okay? There's some fantastic books written about him. If you don't know anything about him and you're interested, you really should go look him up. For about 20 years or so, he was basically the de facto central bank in the United States before we had a central bank, before the Federal Reserve. But in addition to being a prodigious banker, he was well known to be one of the crankiest, most curmudgeonly people to ever live on the face of the earth. Anybody ever been to the New York Stock Exchange here in New York? Right across the street from the New York Stock Exchange is that really short, kind of squat building that looks totally out of place in Lower Manhattan. It's an like 2- or 3-story building for blocks on end. That used to be J.P. Morgan's office, right? And J.P. Morgan was famous for being especially curmudgeonly with the press, right? He was fake news 100 years before Donald Trump was fake news, right? Kind of imagine Donald Trump if Donald Trump had a gold walking stick that he could hit people with. And you get kind of a sense for how J.P. Morgan felt about people in general, but also especially people. And one of the reasons he hated him was because his office was right across the street from the New York Stock Exchange. And this was at a time where he would go outside and he would just say something to somebody in passing. And 10 people would run into the building across the street and it would change trading immediately, right? So he had to be very careful about what he said and who he said it to. And he really hated to talk to the media for that reason. So one time he went out, the markets had a particularly tough day that day. And he went out and there's a huge crowd kind of forming outside his office. Kind of as you would expect, everyone's looking to him for guidance the same way that we would look to Chairman Powell of the Federal Reserve today for guidance. But this was at a time when you could literally just go stand outside his office and try to talk to him. And they all kind of, they cornered him, and they kind of said, Mr. Morgan, what will the markets do this year? Without missing a beat, he said, they will fluctuate. He turned on his heel, and he walked away. Now, it strikes me as one of the best one-liners ever. One, because it's a funny thing to say to a reporter. But two, because it may be the only 100% true thing that has ever been said about the stock market, right? You can't argue with that. There's a lot of things you can say about the stock market. That is the only 100% true thing you can say, right? As an economist, there are very few 100% true things that I can ever tell you. But one of the few is, if you ask me about the next recession, the only 100% true thing that I can tell you is that there will be one. That's it. That's all I got, right? I flew 6 hours to tell you that story. That's all I know. But as economists, just because we don't know the answer doesn't mean we're not very intrigued in trying to guess at the answer, right? So even if we don't know the answer 100%, you're still going to hear from us regardless, right? We'll give you our opinion for free. You don't even have to pay. So one of the ways that we do that, we very rarely make statements. Well, some of us do. But we very rarely make statements that have absolutely zero support whatsoever, right? There's always a reason why we think such and such is going to happen, right? And so I'm going to tell you today one of the reasons why we think when the next recession is going to be, how bad it's going to be, and kind of how we'll do it. So just to set the baseline, our assumption at Moody's Analytics, and notice I said assumption, which is what economists say when they don't know that they're 100% correct. Our assumption is that we go into a recession nationally sometime in the second half of calendar year 2020. For those of you keeping track at home, that's not all that far away from today. Right? Now, the assumption that we have about that recession is that it will be a relatively mild recession, probably somewhere, it's more of a, better characterized as a Wall Street recession than a Main Street recession, very much akin to the 2001 recession, right? And I've got 3 reasons, because you should always have 3 reasons, because 2 reasons sounds like you don't have enough, and 4 sounds like you're making it up. 3 reasons why we think that's the case, all right? So the first reason is that the labor market is in a state it's in. Now you might be thinking to yourself, I just listened to 7 hours of people telling me how tight the labor market is, and how we don't have enough workers, and how wages are going up like crazy. How on earth can this guy fly all the way across the country just to tell me that the labor market is portending a recession? And I would say to you that that is precisely the reason that we expect a recession, okay? Anybody know how long it's been since we were in the last U.S. recession? 9 years, almost 10. So if we get to the end of the current fiscal year, so June 30th for most states, we will be 10 years from the last recession, right? Now, this is usually about the time, so we can assume that we're at or near the top of the business cycle if we're 10 years in. 10 years would be the longest period of expansion in modern American history, right? We will surpass the expansion of the late 1990s if we can get through to the next fiscal year, okay? That's a long time for us to go without screwing something up, right? Which is why precisely about this time is exactly, anytime somebody like myself is up here telling you that, you know, it's been 10 years since last recession, or we're at or near the top of the business cycle, is precisely the time when somebody somewhere is thinking of that really dumb thing that's going to cause the next recession to be even worse, right? I was in New York last week, meeting with a bunch of bankers, and I'm pretty sure that I met some of the people who are working on that really dumb thing. So if you're worried about it, don't. We've got it sorted. It's not in New York. We're going to take care of it. We have been predicting a recession in mid-2020, mid to late 2024, going on 2.5 years now at Moody's Analytics. We were way on the extreme of the kind of consensus spectrum back in the day, but we are becoming more and more in the mainstream. Most shops are predicting a recession sometime around the end of 2020. The reason why we've been predicting that for so long is precisely because of the labor market, okay? So the economists in the room, how many people know what the non-accelerating inflationary rate of unemployment is? Right?
This morning.
No, one economist knows what that is. I had to look it up, and I teach economics. Okay? What most people talk about is NAIRU is what it's talking about. What NAIRU is it's the full employment unemployment rate, right? So it's the unemployment rate at which everybody who wants a job has a job, right? So the labor market is more or less in equilibrium. And we know that the labor market, the unemployment rate can never be 0. It's always got to be a little bit of a number, right? Now, if you ask the consensus, if you went out and asked 100 economists, you'd get 100 different answers, but most of them would cluster around 4.5% unemployment. That's kind of the perceived wisdom out there in terms of the full employment unemployment rate. Traditionally, and going back to World War II or so, when we have reliable data on which to evaluate this, it takes about 3 years for us to go past full employment and then have our next recession, right? So anytime that we have ever gone past full employment nationally, within about 3 years we've had another recession. Anybody want to guess when we were last at 4.5% unemployment? About 2.5 years ago, if you're doing the math correctly. Yeah. Mid-2017 is when we were last at 4.5% unemployment rate, right? Which is why, one of the reasons why we expect a recession to happen sometime in the second half of 2020. Now, there's a lot of variance around that. It doesn't always, you can't set your watch by it. It's like 3 years to the day. Some variances. So we have to look at some other ways to kind of predict when that next recession will be as well. The other thing we have to do is we have to question assumptions, because we're economists and we like to argue. We're never just going to assume that yes, 4.5% is the right number, right? There are a lot of very smart economists out there who are making a very strong argument, I think, that full employment in the U.S. is actually lower than that. It's maybe 4%. If you do that math, then we've maybe got a little bit more room to run in terms of the recession, right? So we can't make a ruling just off of that risk support alone. We have to look at something else. The second thing that we look at, and this is the second reason why I think we're going to have a recession in the second half of 2020, is the yield curve. How many people know what the yield curve is? Okay, how many of you actually know what the yield curve is, or is it just you heard it on Wall Street Journal or CNBC? All right. Has anybody ever looked at the Google Trends data? If you haven't looked at it before, Google Trends is awesome because it tells you what people are searching for and where they're searching for it, right? So you can see where certain key phrases are coming up a lot. And one of the things that we look for a lot is yield curve, because when people start looking for the yield curve and trying to understand what it is, back before we had all this Google Trends stuff, I knew when my mom or my grandmother called me and asked me about the yield curve and TED spread that we were in trouble. Right? Because somebody on cable news mentioned it, and so that's why we've got to start thinking through it, right? The yield curve is incredibly important, and I don't think I can overstate that enough. So every time we have ever had a recession since World War II, the yield curve has inverted, right? And specifically, the 10-year and the 3-month yield curve has inverted, right? It's never given a false positive. It has always been correct. Now, whether that's a cause or a symptom, we can spend days arguing about that. But nonetheless, usually whenever the yield curve inverts, within a year to a year and a half, we go into another recession, okay? Now, why does that matter? The yield curve, which is the difference between long-term interest rates and short-term interest rates, is the best indicator that we have of how profitable a bank is going to be when it lends money, right? So if you think about how banks make money, they borrow money from you and me in our checking account, our savings account. Do they pay us a huge rate of interest on that? No, they pay us very little interest, even a smaller amount of interest lately too, right? And then they take that money and they turn around and they lend it to our neighbors at a big interest rate or a small interest rate? At a big interest rate, right? So they borrow at that 3-month end of the curve from us in our savings accounts, and they turn around, they make 10-year, they make 30-year loans on them, right? So the bigger the gap between the long-term interest rate and the short-term interest rate, the more profitable the bank is going to be lending money, right? So when that 10-year interest rate falls down to about the 3-month interest rate, or inverts, which means that the 10-year is actually lower than the 3-month interest rate, how profitable are banks? They're not very profitable at all, and so they don't make loans. And when banks stop lending money, the economy stops growing, okay? So again, this is not something that is necessarily a cause or a symptom. It's probably both. But every time it's ever happened, within a year to a year and a half, we've had another recession. Anybody know the last time that the 10-year and the 3-month yield curve inverted? It was 2 Fridays ago. So if I do the math here, and I go a year to a year and a half ahead of time, I get roughly the second half of 2020. Right? Now, I should say this with a caveat that normally about this time in the business cycle, at precisely the time that I told you all those people are thinking of stupid stuff to do, somebody like me is going to go on CNBC, and you've probably seen them already. They're going to go on CNBC, they're going to go on Bloomberg, they're going to write in the Wall Street Journal, and they're going to say, this time is different. The yield curve doesn't apply for these 8 really well-researched reasons, and you shouldn't be freaking out yet, and don't worry about it, because we're not going into another recession this time. It's different. Don't listen to those people. Okay? As an economist myself, the only way that we can get on CNBC and Bloomberg and those kind of places sometimes is to say that everybody's stupid and they're doing the wrong thing. Right? No one ever got on CNBC and saying, yeah, that's about right, we're all going to be fine, don't worry about it. Right? And it's our fault because we wouldn't watch that, right? We want to see the idiots out there say that everything's going to be different. So when those people come out of woodwork, and some of them already have, so I'm not saying they're idiots, but I'm saying that they're taking a big leap of faith that this time is going to be different, because it's been right every time since World War II. And if I'm going to be wrong, then I'll be wrong betting that way than on the other way. Okay? So if you see me giving a speech like this anytime in the next year, year and a half, and you see me start to turn into one of those people, because it's a siren song for economists who really like to be on CNBC. Come up here and just slap me right in the face, because friends don't let friends doubt the yield curve. So reason number one is we've got a tight labor market. Reason number two is we've got a yield curve that is already inverted. Reason number three that we expect a recession in 2020 is that there is a major mismatch in assumptions between what the Federal Reserve says they're going to do and what the markets believe they're going to do, right? Now, if you've been watching the market since the end of last year, the markets have been doing fantastic for the last 2-3 months, right? After a very, very bad December, okay? Which kind of shows you how we usually expect this kind of volatility when we hit the top of the business cycle, because business profits, revenues aren't growing as much. It takes a lot more to generate that revenue, and people start to adjust their expectations, right? And what is the stock market at the end of the day? It's a bunch of people's expectations about how companies are going to do. And the only 100% true thing that we can say about it is that it will fluctuate, right? Well, at the top of the business cycle especially, it fluctuates a lot. And it fluctuates because people are trying to go back and forth and reset their expectations. So if I were to give you this same talk 3 months ago, I would have told you that the Federal Reserve is expecting probably 3 or 4 additional rate increases from where they were. I can tell you that the top end of the federal funds rate is probably going to be about 3.5%, 3.25%. But I would tell you also that the markets don't believe that. The markets think they're not going to raise rates again and it's going to be dead flat. 3 months later, has anybody been following the Fed very closely? They changed their mind, right? Because they're economists and we can do that whenever we want, right? Yeah? Change our opinion whenever we want, whenever it chooses to fit us properly. So that's actually the best thing that could have happened. I don't know if you guys realize this, right? Because when those two things are wrong, when the market is wrong and the Fed is wrong, when one of those two are wrong, it's always better if it's the Fed that's wrong or an economist that's wrong, because we have this great thing called Excel where we just adjust the curve down and we fix it. Boom. When the market is wrong, bad things happen, right? Because if the entire market has to reset its assumptions overnight, then all hell can break loose in terms of the equity markets in particular. And that might not be the root cause of recession, but it can certainly be the straw that breaks the camel's back, right? So going into the rest of this year, we have a Federal Reserve that said, you know what, we can be patient. I think we've got maybe 1 rate increase, if any, coming up for the next year. And we're just going to kind of wait and see how things go, which is, I think, a good way to view this if you're the Federal Reserve. The markets heard that, and they said, oh, the Fed's going to cut interest rates, right? Because if you look at the Fed's futures market, they're actually pricing in at least 1 rate cut in 2019, right? Now we're in the same issue we were 4 months ago. So the markets are expecting something different than what the Fed is actually saying they're going to do. Somebody's going to be wrong. If it's the Fed, we just move along, right? If it's the market, bad things can happen. And at a time when we're going to go into a fall where we're going to be arguing about the debt ceiling, we're going to be arguing about a potential government shutdown, we may not have any more clarity in terms of the trade negotiations with China. We have no idea what's going to happen with Brexit. If you were to throw some kind of financial market shock onto the end of that, it could create exactly the perfect storm to cause that next very Wall Street style recession. Okay? So those are the 3 reasons. So labor market, yield curve, and mismatched expectations that we expect to have a recession sometime in the second half of 2020. Okay? Now, have I thoroughly bummed you all out?
Yes.
Good. But I did it with a smile on your face, and that's all that matters, right? As an economist, I've done my job. I can bum you out and keep you smiling at the same time. So, good news, bad news. The bad news is you can't win in a recession, right? Nobody wins in a recession. Everybody loses. The good news is you can take several different steps, especially as a state or a local government, to prepare yourself for that recession so that you can win the recovery, right? And there's a lot of states who are going to win the recovery, and they're going to win that next expansion, right? Recessions don't last forever. I think a lot of people who maybe, if you're an economist and you've only been an economist for 10 years, you may only know the Great Recession, right? You may have forgotten that we've had recessions before. They're not all that bad. We will survive, right? And it won't last forever, right? The average recession lasts about 9 months, right? So human beings and business expansions, gestation period, 9 months, right? There's one coming. There's another one coming, and it's going to be great, right? And they can be better if we prepare ourselves ahead of time to be able to win them. And that means making sure that your state budget is in good shape. Washington has done a pretty good job of that. They've got pretty good rainy day reserve funds. Which means that when we come out of that next recession, they're going to be able to invest in all of the cool workforce development stuff that you guys talked about today. You're going to be able to afford some more tax incentives that maybe other states won't be able to afford. You'll be more competitive as an overall labor market than states who did not prepare by stress testing going into that next recession, right? The other good news is that you can do a lot as a workforce to kind of prepare yourself for that next recession. And for that, you can listen to the very sage advice of Lindsay, lady from the state board. You ready? And I'll be back later to answer questions.